Let's continue this conversation and bring once again to our program our friend here, political analyst Brian Sobel. Brian, good to see you again. We had you on earlier today, kind of as soon as this news broke, and there was so much adrenaline. I don't know if you felt that same way too. Just a historic moment when we talk about American politics. Now that the dust has kind of settled and we're working with what we have going forward to November 2024, let's lay the groundwork for our viewers and kind of recap what we saw today and how significant it is for this election season.
The first thing to keep in mind is that, as you pointed out, there has been a growing momentum for the president to step aside. And this has been going on for a few days, ever since the debate. But we have been watching as an American people for some time the cognitive issues facing the president. And I think the momentum became so strong and the polling looked so bleak for the president that the Democrats, including leading Democrats like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and others, basically said, Mr. President, you have to step aside. And he finally took the decision. From a timing perspective, we kind of thought it was sooner than later. I've chatted with you and others about this, pointed actually to today. But then we saw the Biden people coming out and saying, hey, the campaign goes on. But sources were saying that this decision was inevitable, and it was.
Speaking on all that reaction that you kind of touched on a little bit there with your answer, I want to pull up this. We have a waterfall of tweets because this is stunning news, really. We were expecting it, but of course, it doesn't really soften the blow once you finally get it out there to the public. So you see so many responses here over on social media. We've heard from congressional lawmakers here in the U.S. as well as other world leaders. And this is big heading into November 2024. Now, continuing on with this, Biden has officially endorsed Kamala Harris, but that does not mean that she already has a Democratic nomination. I mean, we're looking ahead to the DNC happening next month, going to be happening in Chicago. Maybe kind of detail for our viewers here the challenges that Kamala Harris and her campaign are going to have heading into the DNC, and also what other Democratic leaders are going to be facing. What is going to be their biggest challenge when banding together behind one candidate?
The candidacy of Kamala Harris now for president, you're seeing a little bit of a groundswell on the Democrat side of the aisle. A lot of people have already issued an endorsement, but others are holding. For example, former President Barack Obama not issuing a letter or an endorsement of Kamala Harris. And there are a lot of people in the party, I think, who are going to wait to see what polling says about Kamala Harris as the candidate. We have to remember that her polling has not been good in some cases, and for quite a while, even less than Joe Biden's. And so she's going to have to make her case before the convention that she's the candidate to back. I think we'll see somewhat of an open convention in the sense that a lot of Democrats are going to want to hear from other people who may want to take on the campaign as a person who wants to be nominated for president of the United States. So today may not be the indicator. There's, it's been a swirling mess, if you will, of commentary and all of that. All we know today is that President Joe Biden has stepped aside. He has endorsed his vice president, although if you read his letter, he thanks her for the years of her service as vice president. But in that letter that he wrote to the American people, it does not have an endorsement, an implicit endorsement. Having said that, he has otherwise said that he endorses as vice president. All of that being said, weeks before the Democrat convention, and you know that already progressive members of the party are not lining up behind Kamala Harris. They see this as an opportunity maybe to get even a more progressive individual nominated as president for president from the Democrat side. So it's too early, really, to decide or to know how this is going to play out. But at this hour, lots of people weighing in on whether Kamala Harris is going to end up being the nominee or somebody else.
I think that's a good segue into this next question that I do have, and that is how does Kamala stack up against other potential Democratic candidates, and what are the accomplishments that her campaign is going to highlight to try to ensure that she gets that nominee?
Well, she's going to say that she's been a partner to the president all the way on all of these various social issues and other things that she spends a lot of time talking about. The flip side of it is that she's been given important roles that don't seem to have panned out very well. First and foremost, dealing with the southern border. She was going to be the person, the point person for the administration on the southern border, and she's been AWOL, absent without leave, on that issue. She can't put lipstick on that pig. She hasn't done anything about the border security issue. She hasn't done a lot on a number of other issues as well. So I think there will be some people in her own party that say, hey, because of those vulnerabilities, she may not be the person who will square off well against former President Donald Trump. It's also true, though, that Donald Trump has not been able to really increase his base among Republicans, those Democrats who might defect, independents, so that he is still stuck at roughly 50% of voter approval. So Democrats would be wise, I think, to take a little time now to see who matches up better against Donald Trump than Harris, or if it's Harris, then to coalesce around her.
I think it's a good point to also bring up kind of how the Republican side is reacting to this news. How is Donald Trump's campaign going to act going forward? Are they going to really focus on Kamala Harris, even though she does not have that Democratic nation just yet?
We'll see. I think the early indication is that the former president says that he doesn't care who the Democrats put up against him. He'll beat Kamala Harris or anybody else that they bring out against him. But time will tell. In all fairness, these things take a while to figure out, and today it's just been one event after another since early this morning when the president issued his statement East Coast time, and so. Again, time will tell. But I want to put this into a greater context, if I may, to say that this is a very interesting time in our history. This is uncharted waters. We keep hearing that phrase, but it is. We haven't seen anything like this since Lyndon Baines Johnson in March of 1968 pulling the plug, which, by the way, delivered Richard Milhous Nixon to the White House. And so that's one thing. The other thing to consider is that you have how the world views this. We know that our democracy is in good shape. We tend to go through these transitional periods well, but that doesn't mean that countries like Iran, North Korea, Red China, Russia don't look at this as a possible opportunity in this interim period to try to push the envelope. And within an hour of the announcement, I was already on Australian national radio explaining for the Australian audience about how this may work. And so what we have to remember is we remain, as a country, the tail that wags the world dog. And so other countries look at us, and this type of uncertainty worries them and worries their governments. So this is a much broader issue than just what's going on here in the United States.
Especially when you consider the fact that under the Biden administration, we have seen the inceptions of two major wars that we continue to follow, the one in Gaza and the one between Russia and Ukraine. So maybe let's talk a little bit more about the wider implications and how world leaders are going to react to this. How does Kamala, for example, or the fact that now it's going to be another Democratic nominee, not Biden, who has been doing all these dealings so far, how is that going to change the world landscape?
Well, I think some nations in the world are going through their own calculus on this, but you have to remember that Kamala Harris does not have international bona fides. She has not been on the world stage. She has as vice president, she's traveled and all of that, but that's not really her background. And she hasn't been a major player in the Biden administration on the international front. So she has to also talk about the international situation that, to your point, Gaza, Ukraine, other places that are brewing around the world. How do you deal with the Houthi rebels? It goes on and on. It is it's a world right now in a bit of turmoil, and the world looks at the United States as the great mediator, and so she has to craft a campaign that isn't just about social issues in the United States, but how are you going to deal with all these world issues? What's your opinion? Set aside the administration's opinion. What is Kamala Harris's opinion, or anybody who rises to the occasion to run for president from the Democrat Party? What is your opinion about all of these major things going on in the world?
You know, Brian, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you your thoughts on Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He did speak just a short while ago, and we showcased it here in those comments that he made to the press gathered outside of the Kennedy home. He said that he is the only candidate who can beat Donald Trump. What do you think about that statement that he made? Is his campaign kind of deviating away from unifying all of these political parties to kind of back that one candidate? How do you think that that's going to affect November elections?
It's not. Robert Kennedy Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has run an interesting independent campaign, but he hasn't been able to move his poll numbers either. Now, what he could do is in a very, very close presidential race, depending on who may break for him, he could help deliver a win to either the Republican side or the Democrat side. And bear in mind that he has criticized both Biden and Trump almost equally. And one of the things that he talked about in his speech earlier is the national debt. And he criticized Donald Trump for increasing the debt by $8 trillion and for Joe Biden not getting his arms around it either. And so I think he's trying to play it down the middle, but it's a tough needle to thread.
Brian, I do want to bring up this tweet that we do have from our Robert F. Kennedy Jr. here. It's kind of cut off President Biden for stepping down. His infirmities were evident to any unbiased observer from the beginning. It was this progressive deterioration and his abandonment of Democratic Party principles that prompted me to enter the race. So, as you mentioned, it's still, I guess we have to wait and see kind of how Robert F. Kennedy Jr. could potentially play a major role heading into November elections. Possibly not with him being that candidate that's elected to be president, but where his supporters lie as we head closer to those elections this year. Brian, I do want to kind of segue back and go to a point that you made earlier today. Kamala Harris responding to that news after President Biden officially announced he was stepping down. He endorsed her. We didn't hear from her for quite a few hours after that huge news was posted. Why do you think that is? What kind of strategy do you think that her campaign is trying to play in the midst of all of these developments?
My guess is that her campaign, her office, decided to let the news of the Biden decision, to sit for a little while before she became the presumptive new leader of the Democrat Party. I think that's it. But I will also say that historically, the office of the president and the office of the vice president is less close, if I may use that phrase, than people think. They have their own apparatus, each of them. That's traditional in American government. So she, I'm sure, knew before Joe Biden made the announcement that he would be making that announcement, but I bet not as far back as we may think.
All right, just continue on here. We do have some more news, of course, this developing story here from Fox News correspondent Jackie Heinrich. On the background from a person familiar, the president and vice president spoke multiple times earlier today ahead of this announcement. Again, that's key when we talk about how quickly all of this news broke and the timing between Joe Biden's announcement and Kamala Harris's. Finally, Brian, I know that we've had you on here kind of dissecting this entire situation. So we do appreciate that you've kind of come back now that the dust has settled and continue to move this story forward. So, in that regard, history teaches us so much. Is there any moment in history, I know you mentioned before with Lyndon B. Johnson, could that potentially give us a glimpse as to how everything could play out come this November?
Well, it's a really great question. And in this regard, it may be informative to know that in March of 1968, before the election, Lyndon Baines Johnson pulled the plug, and the Democrats, had to quickly uh, decide who was going to run for office and who the vice presidential candidate would be. It's not a lot of time, and it wasn't in March of 1968 to put together a new team and to have a new campaign and to get out there, uh, against Richard Nixon. And so is true. It's true today. There are just a few months before the election. There is a nice opportunity for Democrats at the convention coming up to really come together with backing somebody, and whether it's Harris or somebody else, they can turn that convention into something that is able to roll out for the remainder of the time before November. So not a lot of time to do that, but as I've made the point before, we're not talking about people who are unknowns, at least if we're talking about Kamala Harris, Donald Trump. But some of these lesser knowns, if they do take on Harris, they've got to make their case to the American people. And you hear things about this governor or that governor, Democrat, but they're not nationally known necessarily. People may have heard their name, but they have no idea what they stand for, what their policies are. And so there's a lot of work for Democrats in the days ahead. And I would include Kamala Harris in that discussion. People don't know Kamala Harris very well. They know she's the vice president, but she hasn't been front and center in this administration. She's always on the stage, but she's got to make her case to the American people.
Still so much work ahead to be done heading into November elections. As you mentioned, Kamala really has to step up front and center at this moment in time. A truly historic week when we talk about American politics. Brian Sobel, political analyst, always appreciate your expertise. And of course, we'll be speaking to you throughout the remainder of this year heading into those elections. Thank you.
Looking forward to it. Have a great day.